Here's why Aegon II struggled to rule even after his coronation. Aegon II Targaryen's coronation was a moment that should have marked the pinnacle of his power. On paper, he was king, sitting upon the Iron Throne, crowned in front of lords and ladies of Westeros, backed by his mother, Alicent Hightower, and the formidable might of the Greens. Yet, despite the splendor, the pomp, and the prestige of being the crowned ruler of the Seven Kingdoms, Aegon II struggled to truly rule. From the moment the crown rested upon his head, his reign was plagued by doubts, challenges, and a growing sense of instability that would define his rule. To understand why Aegon II struggled, we must first examine the circumstances surrounding his ascension. Unlike a peaceful transfer of power, Aegon's coronation occurred under the shadow of outright rebellion. His half-sister Rhaenyra, named heir by their father, Viserys I, refused to accept his claim. From the very beginning, the legitimacy of Aegon's rule was questioned, not just by the Blacks, Rhaenyra's faction, but by many lords across Westeros who had witnessed Viserys' declaration of Rhaenyra as his successor. Aegon's kingship was therefore born not of consensus, but of division, forcing him to rule in a realm already fractured by suspicion and ambition. Even with the throne beneath him, Aegon was never free from fear. He understood that at any moment, a black dragon could descend from the skies, carrying his half-sister and her allies to strike at the heart of his power. The coronation itself was a tense affair, with whispers of plots and assassination attempts simmering among the nobility. The weight of knowing that his crown could be stolen, his life ended, or his legitimacy challenged at any moment weighed heavily upon him. In essence, Aegon inherited not a stable kingdom, but a battlefield in miniature, and from the start, he struggled to assert authority over it. Another critical factor in Aegon's struggle was his own temperament. Unlike his sister, Rhaenyra, whose ambition and decisiveness often drove her forward even in dire circumstances, Aegon was insecure, prone to vanity, and easily influenced by others. He lacked the political acumen necessary to navigate the treacherous waters of a divided court. His reliance on his mother, Alicent, and her advisor, Otto Hightower, often placed him in situations where he deferred to their counsel even when it conflicted with the reality on the ground. This dependence weakened his authority in the eyes of his allies and enemies alike, creating an impression that the king was a puppet, rather than the master of the realm. Moreover, Aegon II faced the enormous challenge of uniting a faction that was itself internally divided. The Greens were not a monolith. They were a coalition of ambitious nobles, wary lords, and opportunistic bannermen, each with their own expectations and demands. Some supported Aegon sincerely, while others were loyal only to Alicent or to the promise of influence and titles. Maintaining cohesion among such a coalition was no small feat, and Aegon often found himself struggling to satisfy competing interests. Every decision he made risked alienating key supporters, and every hesitation provided an opening for Rhaenyra's faction to exploit. The presence of dragons, while a symbol of Targaryen supremacy, also became a source of pressure rather than security. Aegon II commanded dragons, most notably Sunfire, but wielding such power required skill, courage, and judgment. Unlike Rhaenyra, whose bond with her dragons was fierce and instinctive, Aegon was often cautious, hesitant to risk them in full combat. The dragons, in many ways, became both a weapon and a burden. They were living reminders of the dangers surrounding him, and of the fact that any misstep could be fatal. In a sense, even his most formidable advantages became sources of anxiety, further compounding his struggles as a ruler. From the earliest days of his reign, Aegon II was beset by crises that tested his authority. The murder of Lucerys Velaryon, carried out by blood and cheese, was a pivotal moment. Not only did it ignite the flames of Rhaenyra's vengeance, but it demonstrated that Aegon's court could be infiltrated, that his reign could be challenged even from within. The assassination of a royal heir under his watch undermined confidence in his leadership. It sent a clear message to allies and enemies alike. Aegon II could not fully protect his own family, and if he could not secure the safety of those closest to him, how could he rule the Seven Kingdoms effectively? Additionally, the constant threat of open war with Rhaenyra's forces created an environment in which Aegon's decisions were perpetually reactive rather than proactive. He was forced to respond to crises as they arose, rather than setting the agenda for the realm. This reactive posture left him vulnerable, as it allowed Rhaenyra and her allies to dictate the tempo of the conflict. The Greens could win battles, but strategic mastery required more than victories in the field. It required vision, decisiveness, and the ability to inspire loyalty, all of which were elusive for Aegon. The psychological toll of these pressures cannot be overstated. Aegon's insecurities, coupled with the constant stress of potential betrayal and assassination, created a king who was increasingly paranoid and erratic. Decisions that might have been straightforward became fraught with hesitation. Allies interpreted his indecision as weakness, further eroding confidence in his reign. He struggled not just against external enemies but against the growing perception that he was an unfit ruler, a perception that would haunt him throughout his time on the throne. Another element that contributed to Aegon II's struggle was the tension between public perception and private reality. While the coronation presented an image of strength and legitimacy, the reality behind closed doors was very different. He faced constant pressure from Alicent, Otto Hightower, and other advisors, who each had their own agendas. He had to balance the demands of the crown with the expectations of his faction, all while anticipating the moves of his sister and her supporters. This constant juggling act created a fragile foundation for his authority, one that could be shaken by any misstep or failure. Aegon's struggle was also amplified by the moral and emotional consequences of his actions. The brutal acts committed in the name of consolidating power, including the murders orchestrated by his faction, weighed heavily on the realm's perception of him. Even as he sought to assert control, these acts fueled hatred and resistance among the blacks. The more he tried to solidify his reign through violence, the more resistance he encountered. It was a paradox. The very measures intended to strengthen his authority often undermined it, creating a cycle of insecurity and reaction that defined his rule. We also must consider the role of succession and heirs in Aegon II's struggles. Unlike Rhaenyra, who had multiple sons groomed for the future, Aegon's line was tenuous. The death of his children, such as Jaehaerys at the hands of Blood and Cheese, dealt devastating blows not only to his personal life but to his political legitimacy. A king without an heir is always vulnerable, and Aegon's inability to protect his children symbolized his struggle to maintain control over the realm. It signaled weakness to allies and enemies alike, undermining the stability of the Greens. Moreover, Aegon's reign was defined by internal mistrust and betrayal. Even within his inner circle, loyalties were fluid. Lords who had sworn oaths to him could and did switch sides, sometimes under pressure, sometimes out of ambition. In a court rife with intrigue, Aegon struggled to distinguish true allies from opportunists. This constant uncertainty hampered his ability to govern effectively, leaving him in a state of perpetual caution and defensive maneuvering. The role of dragons cannot be overstated in this dynamic. While dragons were a symbol of power, they were also unpredictable and deadly. Deploying them required judgment, and any miscalculation could lead to disaster. Aegon's cautious use of dragons, combined with the potential for them to turn against him metaphorically through failures or mishaps, created another layer of complexity. He had to manage forces far beyond ordinary human comprehension, a challenge that further exposed his insecurities and lack of